You know that feeling when the air pressure drops right before a tornado touches down? That static charge that makes the hair on your arms stand up and your gut clench with an instinctual warning? That was exactly the vibe in the Willow Creek Estates Community Center the night everything changed. The night Patricia didn't end Oppos. T just win an election. She executed a silent, bloodless coup that would turn our suburban paradise into a surveillance state. It wasn't Oppos. A democratic process. There were no ballots counted by impartial observers, no speeches about community improvement or shared values. It was just Patricia standing up at the front of the room, her posture rigid as a steel beam, announcing with a terrifyingly calm finality that the previous board had stepped down and she was assuming command effective immediately. The room, usually buzzing with the low-stakes gossip of retirees and young parents, went dead silent. A vacuum of shock where we all just looked at each other, waiting for someone to object, waiting for a laugh. But the silence stretched on until it became a heavy, suffocating blanket of acceptance. Patricia had always been a fixture in Willow Creek, a woman whose lawn looked less like nature and more like a computer-generated rendering of perfection, where every blade of zoysia grass stood at attention and the petunias seemed too afraid to wilt. But we had always mistaken her obsession for harmless eccentricity, never realizing that her need for order was actually a desperate, clawing hunger for control that was about to consume us all. It started slowly, like a pot of water set to boil, with a new code of conduct pinned to the clubhouse corkboard, listing grievances that range from the height of our privacy fences to the specific, approved beige tones allowed for our shutters. And suddenly the friendly waves across the driveway were replaced by the snap of her camera shutter as she patrolled the streets in her golf cart, documenting our imperfections like a war correspondent in a combat zone. I think, looking back, her tyranny came from a place of deep, unresolved trauma. Maybe a life that had spun out of control years ago, leaving her with this pathological need to micromanage the universe. But understanding the villain's origin story doesn't end Oppos. To make it any less exhausting when you and Oppos re the one receiving the certified letters in the mail. And oh, the letters came. Thick envelopes landing in our mailboxes with a thud, detailed manifestos signed with Patricia's signature in bold, jagged ink, accusing us of bringing down property values because a tricycle was left on a porch or a trash can was visible from the street at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. She was smart, I'll give her that. Diabolically smart because she didn't end Oppos. Just attack us all at once. She fragmented us, using the neighborhood Facebook group. Let's call it the Willow Creek Watch, to sow discord, whispering lies to Dave, the retired accountant down the street, that the young couple next door was dealing drugs, while telling that same couple that Dave was filing noise complaints against their toddler, effectively turning neighbor against neighbor until we were all isolated in our own little fortresses of suspicion, too busy eyeing each other to notice she was tightening the noose around the entire community. But everyone has a breaking point, and mine came during the holidays, a time that's supposed to be about joy and light, but in Willow Creek had become a gray, regulated season of fear where decorations were subjected to a 10-page rulebook. Yet I decided, perhaps foolishly, perhaps bravely, that I was done living in the dark. I went out and bought these high-end, energy-efficient SmartLume LED strings, the kind that can shift colors and pulse gently, totally within the written bylaws if you squinted at the fine print, and I spent an entire Saturday afternoon stringing them up, feeling this rush of defiance with every staple I hammered into the eaves, a reclaiming of my home from the gray grip of Patricia's aesthetic fascism. The confrontation was inevitable, arriving like a scheduled train wreck the very next evening when a sharp, authoritative rap echoed through my front hallway, and I opened the door to find her standing there, bathed in the soft, defiant glow of my new lights, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. End quote. Those things, end quote. Patricia hissed, gesturing vaguely at my roof as if I had hung radioactive waste from the gutters, end quote, are an assault on the visual harmony of this street. They are aggressive, they are unauthorized, and frankly, they are tacky, end quote. End quote. They end Oppos, re-festive, Patricia, end quote. I replied, forcing a smile that didn't end Oppos. Reached my eyes, leaning against the doorframe to hide the fact that my adrenaline was spiking, end quote. And I checked the bylaws, section 4. Paragraph C. They fall under permissible seasonal illumination, low voltage, non-strobe. I'm in the clear. End quote. End quote. Interpretation is the privilege of the board. End quote. She snapped back, her eyes narrowing into slits. End quote. And my interpretation is that they are a nuisance. They are too bright. They disturb the peace. And if they aren't and oppos, T down by tomorrow, you'll be facing fines that will make your mortgage payment look like pocket change. End quote. End quote. They enhance security. End quote. I countered, throwing out a logical lifeline. End quote. A well-lit house is a safe house, right? End quote. End quote. Safety is my concern, not yours. End quote. She spat, turning on her heel with a military pivot. End quote. Removal is not a request. It is a mandate. End quote. That was the moment the Cold War turned hot, because I didn't and oppos T take them down. In fact, I went into the app on my phone and made them just a fraction brighter, a silent beacon of resistance that shone through the Willow Creek night. And Patricia responded not with more face-to-face threats, but by weaponizing the digital space she controlled. My lights became the main character on the Willow Creek watch page, with Patricia posting grainy, zoomed-in photos that made my house look like a Las Vegas casino, captioning them with rhetorical questions about, end quote, respect for neighbors, end quote, and end quote, class versus trash, end quote, inciting the loyalists she had groomed to leave nasty comments, creating a digital mob designed to shame me into submission, end quote. It looks like a circus, end quote. One comment read, clearly from her friend Brenda 2 streets over, end quote. I can't and oppos T believe we let people like this live here, end quote, said another. And while it stung, while it felt like being back in high school with the mean girls, something unexpected started to happen in the margins, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the tide. People were tired, they were exhausted by the constant negativity, and my lights, my stubborn, unyielding lights, started to become a symbol for everyone who had ever received a fine for a weed in their driveway or a bird feeder that wasn't oppos, non-compliant. And oppos. I started getting subtle nods at the community mailboxes, whispered words of encouragement from people like Sarah, a terrified young mom who had been bullied by Patricia for months over a swing set. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't oppos T just fighting for my right to celebrate the holidays. I was fighting for the soul of the neighborhood. The atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates had shifted from a Cold War to something simmering, something volatile. And while Patricia thought she was tightening her grip, she was actually squeezing sand, unaware that the harder she pressed, the more control slipped through her fingers. The resistance wasn't oppos T loud. It wasn't oppos T marching in the streets with picket signs. It was happening in the blind spots of her surveillance, in the hushed conversations over backyard fences, and the knowing glances exchanged while walking dogs. Dave, the retired accountant who had initially been skeptical of me, pulled me aside one evening near the community park, pretending to admire the landscaping while actually slipping me a folder of printouts. End quote. She's cooking the books, end quote. He whispered, his eyes darting around like we were in a spy thriller, end quote. I've been tracking the HOA dues versus the maintenance invoices and the math ISN and oppos T Matang, friend, there's money disappearing into and oppos consulting fees and oppos that seem to lead right back to a shell company registered to a P.O. box in the next county. End quote. End quote. We need proof, Dave, end quote. I whispered back, feeling the weight of the conspiracy settling on my shoulders, end quote. Real proof, not just spreadsheets, or she'll spin it as incompetence, end quote. End quote. I'm working on it, end quote. He promised, clutching his dog's leash a little tighter, end quote. But watch your back, she's unraveling. I can see it in her eyes. She's losing the narrative, and a narcissist without an audience is a dangerous thing, end quote. And there was another player in this game, a silent guardian named Mr. Elias, an elderly veteran who spent his days sitting on his front porch in a rocking chair that barely moved, watching the street with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He never said much, usually just a grunt or a nod. But the day after Patricia's online smear campaign against my lights peaked, he caught my eye as I was getting into my car, pointed a bony finger at my house, then at Patricia's house across the street, and gave me a slow, deliberate wink that sent a chill down my spine because it felt like he knew the endgame before the dice were even rolled. Patricia, meanwhile, was spiraling, her posts becoming more erratic, her fines more bizarre, until the night she decided that the bylaws weren't and oppos. Enough, that the fines weren't and oppos. Working, and that she needed to take direct, physical action to extinguish the beacon of defiance on my roof. It was a Tuesday. The moon was obscured by heavy cloud cover, creating a pitch-black canvas for what was about to happen, and I was asleep, blissfully unaware that a shadow was moving across my lawn, a shadow armed with wire cutters and a heart full of malice. My security cameras, which I had upgraded thanks to her constant harassment, picked it all up in high-definition monochromatic clarity. Patricia, dressed in dark clothing like a cat burglar from a bad movie, creeping through the azaleas, her movements jerky and frantic. She reached the main junction box for my outdoor smart loom system, and you could see the hesitation for a split second, maybe a flicker of conscience, but then her rigid nature took over, and with a violent, snapping motion, she severed the main power feed to the lights, creating a spark that flared white-hot on the camera feed. But here is where the universe, or karma, or maybe just the complex laws of electrical engineering, decided to intervene in the most poetic way possible. Willow Creek was an older development with a quirksome grid, and our houses shared certain underground transformers, creating a delicate ecosystem of voltage where a sudden, violent disruption in one load can send a harmonic surge traveling back up the line, seeking the path of least resistance. When Patricia hacked that cable, she didn't end oppos. Just kill my lights. She caused a massive backfeed, a surge of electricity that didn't end oppos. Go into the ground as intended, but ricocheted through the shared neutral line, bypassing the safety breakers and slamming directly into the wiring of the nearest connection point, her own house. The irony is almost too heavy to carry, but as she was sneaking back across the street, smugly satisfied with her vandalism, watching my house go dark, she didn't end oppos. Noticed the faint, ominous pop from her own kitchen, the sound of a capacitor in her expensive, smart fridge exploding, or the spark that jumped from an overloaded outlet onto her pristine, terrifyingly perfect curtains. She had disabled her own smoke detectors. This is the part that still blows my mind. She had actually disconnected them weeks prior because, as Dave later found out, she was trying to file a warranty claim on the system and didn't end oppos. Want the data logs to show they were functional, a petty act of insurance fraud that was about to cost her everything. So, while she stood on her porch, staring at my dark house with a smile of triumph, a glow began to build behind her, an orange, flickering beast that was eating her sanctuary from the inside out. It wasn't end oppos. Until the window glass shattered from the heat, the sound cracking through the silent neighborhood like a gunshot, that she turned around, her scream of realization piercing the night, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror as she realized the chaos she had tried so hard to suppress was now literally burning her life to the ground. The smell of a house fire is something you never forget, an acrid, chemical stench of melting plastic and burning memories that sticks to the back of your throat for days. And that night, the air in Willow Creek Estates was thick with it. I stood on my lawn, joined by Dave, Sarah, and eventually the entire neighborhood, watching the orange flames lick the night sky, consuming the perfectly curated facade of Patricia's life. The flashing red and blue lights of the fire trucks painted our faces in strobe light bursts of color, a chaotic light show that was far more intense than the LED lights she had hated so much. Patricia was sitting on the curb, wrapped in a shock blanket, soot smeared across her face, her eyes wide and vacant, watching the firefighters smash through her front door, the door she had painted a specific, board-approved shade of crimson, with axes, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I felt pity for her. But that pity evaporated the second the fire marshal and the insurance investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Miller, started poking around the charred skeleton of her home the next morning. The investigation was brutal and swift because fire leaves clues, but stupidity leaves billboards. Agent Miller discovered the disabled smoke alarms almost immediately, noting in her report that they had been tampered with manually, not malfunctioned, and when combined with the electrical surge data, the narrative began to crumble. End quote. This ISN and oppos. Just an accident. End quote. I heard Agent Miller tell a police officer near the yellow tape. End quote. This is negligence bordering on arson, and the timeline doesn't end Apos. Match her story, end quote. Then came the end quote, red wedding end quote, of HOA meetings, an emergency gathering called in the community center, the very room where Patricia had staged her coup. The mood was electric, not with fear this time, but with the righteous anger of a people who had realized the emperor had no clothes and no house. Patricia, incredibly, showed up, smelling of smoke and desperation, trying to take the podium to spin a story about faulty neighborhood wiring, about how she was the victim. But Dave stood up, his voice shaking but loud, and laid out the financial discrepancies, the missing funds, the fraud. Sarah stood up and spoke about the harassment, the emotional toll of living under a microscope. But the final nail in the coffin came from the back of the room, from the silent sentinel himself, Mr. Elias. He walked slowly to the front, plugged a USB drive into the projector laptop, and without saying a word, pressed play. The footage from his porch camera was crystal clear. It showed Patricia crossing the street. It showed her cutting my wires. It showed her running back. It showed the fire starting moments later. The room erupted, a collective gasp that sucked the air out of the building, followed by a roar of outrage that shook the walls. The vote to remove her was unanimous, a forest of raised hands that signaled the end of an era, but the justice didn't end Apos. Stopped there. As the meeting ended, 2 officers stepped forward, the metallic jingle of handcuffs cutting through the noise. End quote. Ms. Patricia Vance, end quote. One officer said, his voice flat and professional, end quote. You are under arrest for criminal mischief, insurance fraud, and reckless endangerment, end quote. Watching her being led away, the handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights, the cheers from the neighbors were deafening, a release of tension that had been building for years. Her house was gone, yes, but it was her reputation, her power, her iron-fisted control that had truly turned to ash. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek transformed. The fear lifted like a heavy fog burning off in the morning sun. Kids started playing in the streets again, their laughter replacing the silence. The bulletin board, once a wall of threats, was covered in flyers for potlucks and block parties. I reinstalled my lights, and this time, half the neighborhood joined in, turning our street into a brilliant, chaotic, beautiful display of colors that defied uniformity. We learned a hard lesson that year. We learned that authority without accountability is just tyranny in a blazer. We saw how quickly a community can fracture when fear is the currency, but we also saw how powerful we are when we stop hiding and start standing together. And as I sit here on my porch, watching the sun go down over a peaceful, imperfect neighborhood, I have to ask you, at what point does enforcing the rules become a crime against humanity? When does the desire for a perfect lawn justify destroying a neighbor and Apos' peace? Patricia wanted a perfect world, and she burned her own reality down to get it. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, Apos? How many little tyrants are out there right now, holding a pair of wire cutters, convinced they and Apos? Read the heroes of the story, just waiting for the spark that will blow it all up. But hey, at least now, we can leave our trash cans out until 7 p.m. And that, my friends, feels like freedom.